So, Bishop Mark, here we are. Mike Gilbertson has survived this, and so has Bishop Sam. So,
They have been walking with a limp for several weeks, though.
Yeah,
So
there you go. To these mean streets of Sandiway. It's very tough, you know.
I'll turn the microphone on. How about that?
That would help. So, I read somewhere that you were born in Canada. So, tell us a little bit about a young Mark Tanner then, upbringing, background.
I'm a proud Canadian, which means that Mr. Trump is not my favourite character, I have to say, in the world. Although I do have to say, I'd almost put a press release out for Tuesday, but then I decided the Church of England didn't have a sense of humour announcing that we were going to take over the Diocese of Lichfield as our 19th deanery. But yes, I'm a Newfie by birth. So born in St John's, Newfoundland, and the Canadians tell jokes about Newfies in the way that we used to tell jokes about Irish people before we got politically correct.
Okay.
So my favourite joke in the whole wide world, probably, well, actually I've got two, but I won't tell you the other one because you have to wait for that one, is what's black and blue and floats in St John's Harbour? To which the answer is it's a mainlander who tells Newfie jokes.
There we go. Yeah. Now, Sandra and I used to watch a program called The Republic of Doyle, which was your typical sort of private eye thing, but that was based in Newfoundland, and it gave us a yen to want to go there because it's one of the few parts of Canada we've never visited.
Yeah, no, it's an amazing place, and I'm a proud blue passport holder. But moved back over here in answer to your question when I was 18 months old, so culturally British, proudly Canuck, but in that kind of identity. But been over here for almost all my life, so since I was one, so that's 20 years I've spent in the United Kingdom.
Siblings, family upbringing.
Yeah, that's right. The reason we're over there, my father's medical, retired now, but was a paediatrician, so looked after children throughout his life. So I'm a nomad. I've moved around, largely around the north of the country, but lived in, by the time I was 21, I think I'd lived in 26 houses because I'd literally moved so often around between places because they moved from hospital city to hospital city.
And what does that mean to a child to have moved that often?
I think it means your security lies in different places. Well, everybody finds security in different ways, don't they? But I think for me, my security lay in family, in some long-standing friends, and particularly in faith. So I found my own faith when I was about 8 years old, and it's always been part of my kind of self-understanding and narrative. But it also means I settle places quickly, I have to say, and long to be able to settle longer term, which is one of the great things about coming back to Chester. So I was ordained here in the 90s and then was away for a while and came back.
So when did you feel the need to go for ordination?
Well, I'll start slightly earlier than that. So my parents, all four of my grandparents found faith through the Plymouth Brethren. I don't know if you've heard of the Plymouth Brethren, but they're a kind of free church, fairly small but non-conformist denomination. My parents kind of slipped away from that. Dad went off to be a medical student. Mum was training to be a nurse. It's a classic doctor meet nurse story, and they fell in love and so on and so forth. And they kind of wandered away from their faith for a while. But then my sister and myself, so I now have one brother, one sister, but Ben was much later. So Rachel and I were together for the first 14 years of my life. And when Rachel would have been about, 3 or 4, and I would have been about 5 or 6, they got that kind of sense of guilt that parents sometimes get of we really ought to take kids to Sunday school. So they asked around, and the local Sunday school people talked about was at the Baptist church.
And this was in Coventry, I think, wasn't it?
No, this was in London, actually. We were in London for a few years, just living near Blackheath.
Coventry comes into it somewhere, doesn't it?
Coventry does. That was my first full-time, long-term
We'll
job.
come to that in a minute.
So we started going along to Elton Park Baptist Church, and I remember at 8 years old, things made sense. It's one of those where I didn't have a road to Damascus. I wasn't a Christian, then I was a Christian. But there was a night on which I remember saying the prayer at the back of, do you remember 2 Ways to Live? Those kind of Christian books introducing the good news and saying the prayer at the back of that. With my friend Simon, we knelt beside his bed and we said the prayer. And that's when I remember knowing that Christ was not only real and there, but was my Lord and Saviour, and I'd chosen to follow him. Then obviously carried on going to youth group, what have you, moved to Leicestershire because Dad got a job there. And in Spring Harvest, which is like a big kind of Christian festival, happens around Easter. I'm at 14 years old, and some bloke at the front of the youth meeting said, God is calling some of you to full-time Christian ministry. And the thing you probably need to know about me is by first choice of discipline, I'm a mathematician rather than a theologian. So I have a degree in mathematics, although I haven't done much with it since I left university. So I sat there and my logical head was saying to me, you are too young to make this choice. You can't choose at 14 what you're going to do with the rest of your life. But my heart was saying, yep, I know that, but you're called to it. It was literally like somebody had got me by by the soul somehow and was pulling. And I felt myself stand up and walk to the front of that meeting. And I think from then on, I've always known that I was going to be in some kind of ministry of some type. But if you'd have told me at the time I was going to be an Anglican, let alone being a bishop, I just would have laughed in your face, really, because Anglicans were those weirdos who wore Batman-type cloaks and turned up on Remembrance Day. So, I mean, it was just really weird.
So, ordination then come to.
Yeah, so I remember talking to my Baptist minister at the time and saying that I felt a call to some kind of ministry. I assumed I was going to be a Baptist minister, as you can probably imagine I would. Mm. And he said to me, well, you need to go and do some real world job until you're really, really ancient. I think he said 30 years old or something, which when you're like 15 feels like it's forever in the future. And so I was at a bit of a loss trying to work out what to do. Loved maths, and so I thought I'm going to go and read maths. So I went to Oxford to read mathematics. That's where I became an Anglican by accident, because I was at Christ Church and it was opposite a big student church called St Aldate's, which is also where I met Lindsay, my wife. We're both mathematicians, which means everything added up for us. And then we got married and multiplied. Yeah, I know we've done all of those kind of jokes. Okay. So I did that, and my plan was to go and teach. Because I thought, well, I love maths, I love teaching, I've always been a bit of a communicator, maybe that's the thing to do. And I had the most extraordinary spiritual experience. I think only twice have I physically heard God speaking to me. But I went along to, you probably know, but if you want to go into teaching, you do this thing called a PGCE, a postgraduate certificate in education. Some of you, I guess, will have done that. So I went along to the education school in Oxford, met up with my friend John Haynes, and we cycled there, and we were bantering as two young blokes will do as we're kind of messing around on to look at doing the next thing. And we walked into the room, and I remember sitting down, and as soon as the guy stood up to speak at the front, it felt like, well, I've had one or two migraines in later life, but at the time I'd never had anything like that and had no experience of it. It felt like I could see flashing stars, absolutely thundering head, literally felt like I wanted to vomit. I mean, that kind of thing. But the way it felt to me was as if there was a lump of metal shouting, no, 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 bouncing around inside my head. Mm. And I remember saying to John, I'm sorry, I'm going to chunder. Forgive me, that's what I said to him at the time. We were Oxford undergraduates. And I got up and I went and sat down outside the room. There was kind of pew-like thing just outside the room. Within 30 seconds, felt right as rain, as if nothing had happened. And I went and unlocked my bike and cycled back to my house, just knowing I couldn't teach and thinking, well, what am I going to do then? And the other thing I really loved doing was youth work. So I thought, well, I'll apply for a youth work job, and if God opens that door, then I'll do that. And that's where Coventry comes in. So in fact, Lindsay, who now my wife, then my girlfriend, her dad was just leaving Holy Trinity. He was going off to be Bishop of Wilston. And he said, you don't fancy applying for the youth work job at Holy Trinity, do you? I thought, well, why not? Seems like it adds up. So I ended up being youth pastor of a church called Holy Trinity in Coventry, which is right in the centre by the cathedral, where one David Urquhart, who you may remember because he became Bishop of Birkenhead, he was then vicar. So David and I have been friends since the early 90s when he was the brand new vicar of Holy Trinity and I was the brand new youth pastor.
Okay, and what sort of experience was that?
Oh, it was extraordinary, really. So you might remember in the early 90s there were riots in Coventry, and I was literally living by the church in the centre in a medieval house. And I remember one time being woken up at the crack of dawn by my mum, who clearly didn't realise I was a youth worker. It was something like 10 o'clock in the morning. It was just, and she's like, darling, are you all right? I'm like, of course I am, Mum, at least I was before you woke me up. What's that? There've been riots in Coventry. I said, don't be so stupid. Of course there haven't been riots in Coventry. I said, opening the curtains and seeing that perhaps there had been riots the night before, and I'd slept right the way through them. But I think for me, it was one of those times where you put faith to work and see that God really does turn up. So I remember the first time I was just working with a young lad who I knew really well, but he was going through the drug withdrawal phase, and praying for him and seeing a physical difference as we prayed him through that kind of coming off the drug process. Or I think about the challenge that we gave to young people to turn up and pray. and sort of 5 or 6 young people saying, we really want to do this, how are we going to do it? So the way that school buses worked in Coventry was everybody got a bus into the centre of town, they all got off the bus from their home, changed the bus to their school, and then went back out to their school. Really sensible system when you think about it. And our church was right by the bus stops where all these kids kind of got off and on. So we said to these kids, why don't you come into our church centre, we'll put toast on, we'll give a great name to it, we call it Prayers on Toast, which seemed to us brilliant as a name for things. I remember the first week we prayed, we got about 5 or 6 young people who came along to Prayers on Toast. By the 7th or 8th week, we had about 40 young people praying at 7:30 every Wednesday morning in the centre of Coventry. And the stuff that God did was extraordinary. So literally, just as I left Coventry, it was 1995, Youth for Christ did the first of their mega missions, which they were trying at the time. I say first, might have been second or third, but one of the really, really early ones. Do you know 400 young people gave their lives to Jesus? 400 young people. And I look and think, well, you have 40 young people praying. Is it any surprise that actually loads and loads of young people give themselves to the Lord Jesus Christ? And I think one of the things I want to say tonight, but also to the Diocese of Chester, is we need to remember that prayer works. Prayer makes a massive difference, and we need to devote ourselves to it. Desmond Tutu said, people say that answers to prayer are just coincidences. All I can say is, when I pray, coincidences happen. So, yeah, I can't remember what you asked, but is that an answer?
Yeah, that's a very good answer, yes. So talk us through highs and lows of you. Just any highs and lows in whichever order you want. They don't have to be chronological. Just talk us through it. Give us a flavour of your ministry from then through to now.
Yeah, I mean, the highs are always people meeting Jesus. And that will always be the high, because it's like being, I've got 2 kids, Jonathan and Pippa, being present obviously when both of them have been born. And when people give their lives to Jesus, it's like that. It's like seeing life being born in people, and there is nothing but nothing which is a greater privilege or joy. And I think the lows are the relational trauma that we so often put ourselves through in the church. And we forget to keep the main thing, and then we're surprised when we fall out with each other. So I've ministered in some really tough places. I mean, just to give you a brief chronology, so Coventry as a lay youth worker, went to Durham to read theology, then came here. I was curate on the Wirral just outside Birkenhead, a place called Upton, which was an amazing place. Both kids were born in Arrow Park Hospital, so I keep reminding them they're plastic scousers and they love me for it. And then we went from here to the Red Light District in Doncaster, which I always used to say was the kind of place Jesus would have been vicar of if he'd been a vicar somewhere. And that was really tough in terms of the kind of social context we were in. So some of the stuff on the door was just horrible, really. And also quite hilarious. So I remember my licensing, my kind of plumbing in when I was made the vicar. And we'd been in the house for 4 or 5 weeks by then. But my mum and dad brought my little sister and my little brother across to the service. And they knocked at the door, and obviously we let them in. And Mum said, Dad's just going to go and park the car. Well, of course, loads of people had turned up to the service by then, so parking the car was not easy. And about 10 minutes later, my father, who obviously I know really well, turned up absolutely ashen and white. I was quite convinced he must have knocked somebody over or had a road accident or whatever. I said, Dad, what's the problem? He said, a young lady's just got into the car and asked if I wanted a good time. So funny stuff, some quite violent and horrible stuff as well. I went from there to North Yorkshire to be vicar of Ripon, and I was also an army chaplain, Area D, 1 or 2 other things on the side. And again, the kind of, those of you who are clergy in the room will know exactly what I mean. Sometimes the toughest stuff is also the most precious stuff. So I think about the first sapper, which is like a private in the engineers, that I had to do the funeral for, who'd been killed in theatre in Afghanistan. The most traumatising, horrible thing, but actually the most extraordinary privilege to speak hope into those kind of situations. And I think really eye-opening for somebody like me, where you're living out faith in an environment where every other word is the F word, but I don't think Jesus really minds in quite the way that we get very prim and proper about. So again, I can't remember what you asked. But
highs and lows. So that'll do. So let's get on to the Church of England faces some challenges at the moment. We know that. So give us your views on where you think we are, whatever.
I might need to be slightly more specific because I could talk to you for hours about
let's
that.
talk first of all. Of course, when we it seemed forever when we set this up. It must have been a year ago, I guess. So we had no idea that Justin Welby would have resigned and wouldn't be on the TV this morning. Did he? So he talked this morning about the way he feels and how he wants to become obscure. Just give us some views on in whatever, obviously your own words, in whatever you feel you could say about his situation and about the next. Whoever the next Archbishop is.
Yeah. And just to be clear, I haven't yet had a chance to watch his interview. So obviously I've read some of the briefing that came to, I'm on the House of Bishops Standing Committee, so I've read some of the briefing that came out before, but I've not yet watched the interview. So let's be really clear, the Church has failed dreadfully on safeguarding. And we see that nationally, and we see it in this diocese. So when I arrived in 2000, the Pearl Review into the work of Victor Whitsey, or I shouldn't say work really, the abuse that Victor Whitsey participated in, was published. And we have been culpable in covering up and turning a blind eye to the abuse that's happened. And we just need to name that. I genuinely think we are in a far better place now than we have been, and that's not primarily thanks to me or to any individual, it's thanks to us. We've begun to take this seriously, and Janet can say to you, we did a little kind of swearing of oaths beforehand in the room here, and one of the things I said was, I'm going to give you a license, but it's dependent upon having your safeguarding up to date. And Janet was like, no, of course it is, I completely get that. So we've taken on this sense of safeguarding really matters. I have some sympathy for Justin because so much was going on, but he very clearly missed something, and it was absolutely right that he took responsibility for that and stepped back. I don't know what I'll think when I watch the interview. There are some things he said which make me wince, and I think, frankly, he needs to be more aware of the impact of some of that on those who are survivors. The issue that we now find ourselves with, which I think is more serious than almost anything, is trust is at an all-time low. And that's true, particularly in the church, but I would say across the piece where we are in Western society.
If I may just cut across you, I'll give you an example of that. Somebody who I don't know very well, but is in a closed group of musicians with me, and he recently was complaining that somebody had scratched his car. And he actually wrote on Facebook, I found out that the other people whose cars were scratched are Christians, but let's face it, that doesn't mean these days, does it? And I just thought, that's a shame. That's the way the world sees us. So forgive us for interrupting you, but it was just...
I think you're absolutely right. And we live in a world where, I mentioned earlier that I'm Canadian, somebody can come to power in the most powerful nation in the world who is a convicted felon and whose first thing that they do is they release those who have been tried by law and put into prison for carrying out riotous behaviour. Now, I think that's a very dangerous place to be. And it's not just that I want them to keep hands off my sort of Canadian nation. No. But actually, we're in a really, really difficult place, which means that we need to make sure that we are more and more transparent because we trust people that we know rather than trusting people who are distant. So if you ask me to later, because there was one question I knew I could actually answer because I've just written something for the Crown Nominations Commission about what we need for the next Archbishop. Okay. We need somebody who's known, somebody who's transparent, somebody that people feel they can relate to, because there is no other way that we can trust. And you could hear me say, this is dangerous and entirely negative. Actually, I have to say there are some real strengths to that, because I should not be trusted simply because I'm a bishop. I should be trusted because if you believe I am trustworthy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does absolutely.
And so much abuse and bad practice has previously been swept under the carpet because people in authority, not just clergy, but in all sorts of authority, have simply said, well, I am so-and-so, you must trust me. And I do think we live in a much better world where actually we...
No, that makes sense if you know you can trust somebody. I get that completely. So one of the things that... I haven't done it in detail, but I had a quick look through because you were here tonight. So one of the things Justin says is that keeping the communion together is an absolute priority. When there was anything that endangers that, he would avoid and try to do. So on that, does it matter whether the next Archbishop of Canterbury is a man or a woman in a general sense, or is that likely to be a problem because of its possibility of fracturing the church?
I'm immensely glad to say I won't be choosing the next Archbishop of Canterbury. I am absolutely committed to the fact the post must be open to men and women. And one of the sensible conversations we need to have as a communion is what impact that would have. The Church of England is rightly proud of having all orders of ministry open to men and to women, and that really, really matters. Mm-hmm. I think one of the things which we might look back on and say Justin both did well, but not completely, he spent a lot of time with the communion, so 14 trips a year out to be on average, to be out with the communion. But almost all of that work was work that he did. And maybe that needed to be so. But actually we as the communion find ourselves often not having the conversation. And the thing I find when I'm out and about in different places around the communion is mostly when you're in conversation, there's agreement. Because in reality, you and I don't need to agree on everything in order to be friends. That's just not the way the world works. What we need to do is be reasonable, be approachable, demonstrate our kind of integrity, our commitment to each other.
And focus on the things that bind us together rather than the things that separate us.
Yeah, but also be real and frank where there are things that we disagree on, because that's the way that relationships work. And actually the Anglican communion is far stretchier, to use a theological term, sorry about that, but it's far stretchier than, for example, the Roman Catholic Church would be, or the FIEC or other things go to the other kind of ecclesiological pole. We do find ourselves, almost our kind of founding nature is this kind of via media, this middle way of doing things. And one of the things I've long noted is when you look at local fellowship in towns or cities around the place, it's usually the Anglicans that act as the kind of buffer zone or glue in the middle, because we're basically an ecumenical movement under one roof. We know what it is to stand together, which isn't for a moment to be lackadaisical about it or say we've got all the answers. It just feels to me part of our nature.
Okay. So let's move on to things in Chester then. You instituted a process to create a vision.
Yep.
Which you've always said is not your vision, but it would be Jesus's vision. But how is that going? And what would you like to see it achieve? When would you think that we would recognise it and the difference it's made?
Yeah, so it's actually a two-stage thing, and I hope it is Jesus' vision, but I talk about it being our vision that we've discerned that the Lord has given to us rather than Mark's vision, because it must be. So the vision process was a large listening thing, and thank you to all those here who took part in that. And we came out with a very clear focus in the vision. And the way I describe it is the vision is seeing where we want to go. And then strategy, which I'll tell you about in a moment, is working out how we get there. So this focus on the 1.5 million, because there are 1.65 million people in this diocese. And all the stats tell us about 90% of England have no meaningful contact with a community of faith. So we don't get 10% of people worshipping, but about 10% have some kind of meaningful contact with a community of faith. So the challenge that came through the vision is how do we cross that divide? And it works, you know, if you've got a parish with 5,000 people in it, well, you're going to have about 500 people you've got contact with. So what do you do to just begin to reach out to the 4,500? So this sense of how do we reach the 1.5 million? That came through as the vision. That work's been done. I've already begun to see that, and I think across the diocese we've begun to see that question really landing. That sense, as William Temple put it, of being a church which exists for the non-members is really key. What we're now embarked upon is the strategic process, and here we're trying to walk a really fine balance, as we are with lots of things, LLF being another example, where we don't want to go too far one way, where we become a kind of command and control diocese, a bit like being back in the army, where, you know, do this, do that, because the Church of God just doesn't operate like that, not least because every community around this diocese is individual and unique. So it always needs to be the local church, because it's the local church that changes lives. But God didn't put us together into a diocese by accident. So the question is, what can we do better together that we're not doing? And at the moment, we've got 4 strands. They're around growing disciple, growing leaders, growing connections, and growing communities. And I always forget one of them, so I'm quite proud of myself. I just remembered all 4. And within each of those, some specific projects. So again, if you look at the statistics, and forgive me, I did say I was a mathematician, then if you want to make contact with those who are not in the faith, what you do is you establish a new worshipping community of some sort. And that can be all singing, all dancing, multi-million-pound resource church, or it can be a knit and natter group that just meets once a week and worship, and everything in between. flourish communities and schools and so on and so forth. But what happens is you establish something and people come along. And I think that's partly because God is doing stuff. It's partly because we're enthusiastic and partly because we think in different ways. Have you got time for me to tell you a story?
Yeah, if I'm smiling at you, we have a group called the Nutty Knitters, which
Oh, do you?
Mike and Barbie wave. So,
There you go. Nice to see you. But it is exactly that thing. So under the growing communities, one of the challenges that will be coming out through the strategy thing is, how do we do that around the place? And how do we make sure that if, for example, you're in Wallasey, maybe you have much more to do with Crewe, which is many miles away, different archdeaconry, different side of the diocese, than you would with people in West Kirby. So how do we make sure those kind of links can happen so we can get something happening between Crewe and Wallasey, because that's actually where there's a similar heart, vision and need. But just in terms of the energy of stuff, one of the things that I'm doing right at the moment, because I've got to talk about motorbikes, because you didn't ask me about them.
Yeah, well, I can look. If you look there, look, I've got. Don't forget about motorbikes.
Yeah, and you did. It's just right there, you see. So one of the things which I did last year was I spent a weekend in Congo. And you might think you misheard me, but I literally spent a weekend in Congo because the Archbishop there, Archbishop Andy, had asked me to go and preach at their ordination and speak at their diocesan conference. So I bobbed over for the weekend, and I had to be back because on the Tuesday I'd promised my mum a year beforehand I was going to take her to the Buckingham Palace garden party.
Okay.
Most of you haven't ever met my mum. She's 4'10", but what she lacks in height, she makes up for in fierceness. So it was absolutely vital I was back in time. So I got there, and there were 700 motorbikes. They were crammed into every possible space in the cathedral and the complex. And if you've been to our area, you'll know the kind of big complex that they have there. And they were just brilliant. And I said to them, can I have a ride? And they said, oh no, it's far too dangerous. And I thought, your definition of danger and mine are two completely different things. It's the only time I've ever been in a country where there's been a coup d'etat while I've been there. It's the only time I've literally been anywhere where they said to me, you're perfectly safe. The killing squads are 70 kilometres away. And I'm like, okay, I think riding a motorbike might be a little safer. But they do everything on these little 125 bikes, which they ride around. So they run midwife training and services, they run nursing things, they run education, they run church. So on the plane on the way back, being overtired, I came up with what I thought was a brilliant idea, and I'm now stuck with the name, which was the Biking Bishops Biking Mission Fund, because I love riding motorbikes. So on Holy Saturday between Good Friday and Easter Sunday, I've just decided that we will do a ride out starting at Church House.
I saw that on the diocesan newsletter.
Yeah. So if any of you are bikers, you're welcome to come along. Well, why am I telling you about it, apart from the chance to talk about motorbikes? Because the number of people I've got contact with through saying we're doing this ride out is in aid of work in Congo for the church, for healthcare and what have you. And people at left, right and centre, bikers, I really want to be. And suddenly I'm in email contact with all sorts of bikers because we're doing something interesting for a purpose around something they're already passionate about, and community gathers. So if I can plant an idea around the vision and strategy for you tonight, it is, why are you not riding motorbike? No, that's not the idea. It is, what could you do to gather people? It might be as simple as knitting. It might be, a rambling club. I mean, walking, not waffling. It could be board games. It could be all sorts of things where you say, how about we gather? And we allow the conversation to turn really naturally to Jesus. Because the thing I've found, and you have a bit of an advantage and a disadvantage when you wear one of these, is that most people out there are genuinely fascinated by faith. And we who are Christians think, I can't talk about Jesus, nobody will like me anymore. But honestly, if you're talking to somebody and you say, can I say a prayer for you? I have to say, I've said that all the way through my adult life, and only once has anybody ever said no. And that was somebody who was already in church. But literally, would you? You don't mean now, do you? No, I just mean when I get home. Can I? Yeah, of course you can. And what's the name of your mum who's got this situation? Well, it's Sue. Can you pray for her? Yeah, no. And next time, did you pray? Yeah, I did. It's amazing. She got better. People are fascinated by faith. So where can you gather people? And how can you just talk really naturally about Jesus? You will be astonished. Not everybody wants to become a Christian, but you'll be astonished how interested people are in faith.
Okay, that's very interesting. Thank you. Living in love and faith, where do you think we are with that? Give us your views on that in whatever way you feel able to.
Well, I think with living in love and faith...
Maybe explain what it is if anybody, because we talk the language all the time. And if we just give a brief explanation. Living in love and faith, if you don't know, is the discussion about same-sex marriage is it's I don't suppose it's entirely about that, but it's the thing that is the most controversial and the thing that people talk about all the time.
Yeah, it's not primarily around same-sex marriage, but it is around same-sex relationships. What we're trying to do with LLF, I think, is what we so often try to do in the Church of England, which is hold two things together which are apparently irreconcilable. And those two things are, what does the Bible teach around family relationships and the proper place of sex and sexuality? And there are clear bits of teaching in the scripture and people who hold very strong and clear views on that. And at the same time, be a church which is genuinely open to everybody just as they are, because we believe that Jesus meets us where we are. And of course, he doesn't leave us there. It takes us on a lifelong journey of faith. But the truth is, you can come just as you are to Jesus. You don't need to change a thing before you come to Jesus. And the scriptures are littered with examples of that. When I was 16 years old, I again was in the Baptist church. And the Baptists do this thing where they baptize in a kind of full immersion tank at the front. And then the minister stands there dripping wet. And he says, if any of you feel that you need to be baptized, you need to come forward. And I remember I was sitting about 2/3 of the way back on the stage left, right-hand side of the congregation. And I knew I needed to go forward that evening. And they sang the hymn, which has stayed with me for the rest of my life. Just as I am, without one plea, but that thy blood was shed for me, and that thou bidst me come to thee, O Lamb of God, I come. Just as I am, poor, wretched, blind, sight, wretched, healing of the mind. Yea, all I need in thee to find, O Lamb of God, I come. So we're trying to hold together, how do we welcome everyone and explore what the scriptures teach about human sexuality, about the nature of family and what have you. And I think we are making three mistakes in doing that. Firstly, we're giving ourselves over to shoutiness. So we are giving ourselves over to say, these are my red lines, I will not go anywhere else. Secondly, we're giving ourselves over to talk about what other people should do rather than what we should do. And I just don't see that in the scriptures. I see the scriptures teaching me how I should live, and then encouraging me to bring other people to the scriptures, because it's not me that changes your life. And if anything, the Holy Spirit's working in you this evening as you listen, it'd be God engaging with you. And he might use a poor vessel like me. So I think, A, we're giving ourselves to shoutiness. B, we're looking more at others than we do at ourselves. And Jesus said something about logs and specks. And the third thing I think we're doing is we're not being clear about process. So there is a big thing around the doctrine and teaching of the Church of England. So Janet, when she made the kind of promises in here, actually promised that she wouldn't do anything which wasn't authorised or allowed by canon. Now, we have changed the doctrine and teaching of the Church of England often since the Reformation, most recently and most majorly when we agreed that we would ordain women to the presbyterate, so to be priests, and then to the episcopate, so to be bishops. There is a proper process for that. And I'm very up if the church wants to have the conversation, But what's happening at the moment is Synod is constantly dancing around things, and stuff is being brought in rather than going through what's called the Canon B2 process. Okay. So we absolutely need to have the conversation. But firstly, we need to be those who refuse to shout at each other, because that's not the Christian way. Mm. Secondly, we need to be those who look primarily at ourselves. How do I live in a way which is holy, which is loving, which is faithful and mighty? And then thirdly, we need to be real about doing stuff in the proper way. We have processes and we should be following them.
And is it likely to happen, that? I mean, what could happen to make that happen? Because I think that's very interesting, and I think that's possibly surprised one or two people here. Because you are right. I mean, what we hear or what we read are the shouty people. Mm.
When you say, is it likely to happen, what's the it, do you mean? Sorry.
To move towards the process that you're talking about, what would that take? Because I've never been to General Synod.
Well, you're lucky. I've been on it for 10 years.
I spoke to somebody recently who is a member of General Synod. I said, what's it like? And he said, depressing. So I left it at that.
I both love it and hate it, if I'm honest. I've been on it for 10 years and I've got another 20 to go unless the Lord comes early. I think it massively depends on the next Archbishop of Canterbury.
Okay.
So Archbishop Justin is kind of background is in reconciliation. So he began this process, which was a listening exercise, and then we've tried to push things forward in a way which seems to me to go against the listening process. I think the new Archbishop will come in and I hope will be able to guide us through to a place. I'm absolutely committed to the fact that we need both things which appear irreconcilable. Because that's what God does. He meets us in the middle and he transforms. So one of the things I often say in schools, because they say, what does a bishop wear? And I point to the fact we all wear these massive pectoral crosses. And I say, if you want to understand what happens on the cross, Jesus reaches out with one hand and will not let go of you and me. And he reaches out with the other and will not let go of God the Father. And even though the two are irreconcilable, he holds on and will not let go. And the most amazing thing about his death is he reconciles the irreconcilable. He bridges the unbridgeable. And in him, we find that place of unity. So actually finding a way through that enables us to hold on to the scriptures, to hold on to Christian tradition, and to welcome everybody, and actually then let Jesus do the work, because that's what we're all about. We have no hope apart from the Lord Jesus Christ. That's not theology, that's practice. It feels to me as if it's the only way that we can find.
Thank you. That's a very comprehensive, most interesting. So is there anything that I haven't asked you which you would like to say to these good people of Sandiway and Cuddington? Any message that you, and there may not be, I didn't.
Well, I was going to finish with a story. Is this the opportunity to do so?
This is the opportunity.
Just based on the reading that we've got, which is the most extraordinarily challenging reading. And it feels to me as if it's a key reading for the times in which we find ourselves. Because what Jesus encourages the disciple to do is to go out and live as if everything is lost unless God turns up. And one of the things that I think we have a problem in the modern church is we have too much. We have too much money, too much expertise, too much experience, too many buildings, and it gives us the impression that we can carry on with our work as if God not turning up wouldn't make a difference. And the challenge that I give, kind of theologically speaking, is that we must stop being those who are functionally atheist, who live as if God has got senile and forgotten what he's about. And the risk I want to say to you is, how would it be this week if you took God at his word and put yourself in situations where the only way out is God turning up and meeting people? When I was moving from Ripon to Durham, so I went back to Durham to run the vicar factory that I myself had been at. Our children were, let me just think, 9 and 11. And part of the philosophy of parenting Lindsay and I have always bought into is that we teach the children the way of trusting Jesus in practice as we go along. So we'd said to them, that you mustn't talk about this. This is family business. But Daddy's been asked to explore whether he should go and work in Durham, training people to be vicars. And we're praying about it. We want to know whether it's what Jesus wants for us, because if it is, we want to do it. And if not, then we don't. And we have to say the children actually have been remarkable with that kind of learning to pray and what have you. So it was, I was being interviewed to be warden of Cranmer Hall. And it was the most extraordinary interview process. Came out of one of the rooms, stood on the staircase outside the senior common room in St John's College, Durham, if you happen to know it. And I got the opportunity to ring the kids. So I got through to my daughter first. And she said to me, "Daddy, what's Jesus been saying to you about this job?" And so I told her a story I haven't got time to tell you, but just about praying and seeking to trust Jesus in it. And I said to her, "Love, what's Jesus been saying to you about this job?" And you know how when you know somebody really well, even though you're only hearing their voice on the phone, you can absolutely picture the face of them. And I saw my 9-year-old daughter's face just drop just by the tone of her voice. She said, "Oh, Daddy," she said, "I've been praying all day," she said. "And all Jesus has said to me is, trust, 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 trust." She said 4 times. And I stood there on the staircase being interviewed for the biggest job I could ever imagine doing in the church, with tears streaming down my face, realizing I'd just been taught the heart of discipleship by a 9-year-old girl whose dad was being interviewed for a job which would take her out of a school that she loved in a place that she loved to a whole new adventure. But she caught the idea that this was all about trust. And in reality, the challenges that face this diocese, or the Church of England, or this parish, are beyond any of us. But that's all right, because God is beyond any of us. So what would it look like this week to take a risk for your faith? To start a conversation with somebody, to offer to pray for them? What would it look like to put yourself in a situation where, unless God turns up, you're going to look like a proper banana. Because I'll tell you this, I've discovered I would rather look like a proper banana 9 times to catch God doing something the one time than never see God do anything at all. It was the lesson for the disciples, and I think it's the lesson for us today.
Thank you. Is there anything that I've missed that anybody is screaming to ask Bishop Mark? I guess, thank you very much, Bishop Mark Tanner. Thank you for being so honest.